So today we're going to talk about Chapter 9, which is, has to do with staffing, training, compensation for global operations. So what I like to do is kind of talk a little bit more about, I'm going to discuss strategic importance of international human resources management. What is the function that they have? The main responsibilities, major staffing options for this kind of global operations, the factors that involves in these type of choices, the need to manage performance for expatriates, and I'll share some of my own experiences as an expatriate when I work in different markets, the role of a host country manager and the needs for their training, the appropriate compensation package, and the various international human resources practices around the world. So let's kind of move forward with the first one when it comes to do with strategic. So one of the things that the chapter describes is the BRIC countries, and we talked about how these BRIC countries, China, India, Russia, Brazil, work when it comes to looking for a specific talent, staffing among these operations. So one of the things that we find out is the fact that in some cases, they have been outspaced, or the supply of high to upper or upper to middle level management does not exist. At the same time, there's a need for about 75,000 business leaders, but there's only about 3,000 to 5,000 that can be available. Additional, there is not enough skills and not enough skills for foreign companies to be able to hire. So for these four countries, one of the things that I wanted to kind of mention is the fact that, if I can go to the right slide, let's talk about these countries. So in the case of Brazil, there's a deficit of upper level management. So they're looking to find talent that can help them at that particular level. In the case of Russia, there's a deficit of all kind of management. When we look at India, there's a deficit of starting at a mid-level, also dealing with brain drain. You know, they've kind of worked them too much. So there's a lot of that situation where there's not enough talent to be able to fill some of those positions in India. China has it more with severe deficit for all types of levels when it comes to management. So this is a situation where international human resources is looking to find the right type of management to hire and to maintain in these companies. So when we look at in general and talk about this type of emerging markets, one of the things that is going to attract some of these potential recruits are going to be the fact that if they're going to be working for a company, they want to be sure they work for a company where there's a brand, a global brand that is known for excellence. And so that's what's going to attract someone to work for a company, if the company has a good name. The other thought is purpose, the purpose of this company. A company that is breaking into the new market, it has a good new model, and so the purpose is important for a recruit to go and work for the company. A company that provides a fast-track training and career path. Most people that want to work for a company, there's not some kind of future for them. And then, of course, one important part, as you're dealing with a global company, is culture. What type of culture does a company have? An example that I can give is when I worked for Cerner here, and I did a lot of their upper management level. Culture-wise, a lot of work, a lot of hours, and so people really want to know, how many hours would I be putting into that? The culture of a company is very critical. So all these areas about branding, purpose, opportunity, and culture are critical for recruiting when it comes to emerging markets. Let's move forward to the type of functions that the international human resources management has. So this is very important. When we look at the type of different functions, they're going to be looking to hire people, and they're going to be looking to do several things. So let me highlight a couple of areas that are very important. Let's not forget that they're looking to recruit. That kind of selection is important for a multinational corporation. When they recruit, they want to be sure that they're doing enough training for the development of those particular managers that they're going to be hiring. The training is critical for success. Compensation is very important, as it has to do with recruiting, training them, and compensating them for good and high performance. And lastly, that management for expatriates. And we're going to get into what exactly does the expatriates represent and how do we go about retaining them and working with them. So let's move on a little bit further than that. This is a very important piece that you need to know. The type of different operations, staffing for global operations. We have talked in several occasions about the fact that there is a specific approach ethnocentric approach. I underlined that twice. What it has to do, and let me kind of go back, this particular ethnocentric approach has to do with the fact that the headquarters is looking for people to run a particular company overseas. So the key word here is the parent country, in the sense that they're going to be sending people from the headquarters to foreign markets. Ethnocentric has to do with the fact the way we do things in the United States is the way we want to do things in a foreign market. So there's an approach to hire someone from the headquarters, parent company, to send him to a foreign market. Now there's another approach. That approach has to do with polycentric approach. And the key word here is polycentric, poly. And that has to do with the fact that we're looking for a multicultural or multinational strategy. Several strategies. What it has to do is, now we're looking into specific areas, and that means basically we want to be sure that there's a host country nationals that are being hired. So one of them has to do with headquarters sending their employees to a foreign market, the parent company. But in this case, for polycentric approach, has to do a little bit different, where we have host country nationals, nationals or employers within that country. U.S. versus that particular host country nationals. Now there's another two more approaches that about staffing global operations. One of them has to do with third country nationals. Keep in mind, and you're going to see this kind of terminology, this is a third country national. You might be hiring someone from another market to work in another country. So let's say an example could be hiring someone from Peru to work in a country like Ecuador. So they are third country nationals. Not necessarily from the US or the headquarters, not necessarily from Peru, but from Peru to Ecuador or some other market that is very similar. The last approach when it comes to staffing of global operation has to do what we call regional centric. And so this is another one. So how do I differentiate between the global staffing approach and the regional centric? Geographical has to be with another third market. It doesn't have to be the same region. So I can be hiring someone from France to work with someone in a country like Venezuela. So they're not really related. But when you look at the region, like the region-centric has to do with the same type of region. Same countries, whether they're European markets altogether, where it has to be Central America, so it's the same type of region. That's what we call a mix of different types of specific managers, so that mix is the key word here. So I'm going to kind of review a little bit. When you go back, you have ethnocentric headquarters. Polycentric has to do more with the fact that it's more of a host country nationals. Global staffing, which is more a third country nationals, not necessarily from the same area. And the last one is a regional centric approach, which is more a combination of a mix of all of them. That's the way how they go about staffing. So here's a great summary. When we look at the strategic mode and we look at the original organizational variables and staffing organization, this is a comparison when we're looking at the strategic, we're looking at the perpetuation, we're looking at the evaluation, and we're looking at the type of rewards. So when we look at those four bullet points, each particular one has its different ways of staffing their employees. This is international, so it has to do more from an international perspective, but it comes from the headquarters. Those people coming from the headquarters is what we call expatriates, and we're going to get in more details about expatriates. They are actually following an evaluation from their home country, so the evaluation is being given by the headquarters. The rewards are more from a high from the US, in that case if it was coming from the US rewards, and very low when it comes to the subsidiary when they're working at. So here is talking about strategic being international, expatriates, evaluation from the home country, rewards, again, what's been done in the headquarters. Polycentric is multi-domestic, and more of a general way of looking at the strategic orientation. Local use of key positions locally. So now, instead of being expatriates from the headquarters, it's going to be from locals, local people coming from a particular market. That determines the evaluations. The evaluation is determined by the country where they're at, and then the type of rewards, it varies depending on the country. Region-centric is regional, and this is what we talk about from a specific country. Let's say you're working with Ecuador and Peru, same region. People are used from the same type of region. the rewards and evaluation again has to do based on the contribution and based on the regional direction of whatever country you're working with. And then global has to do more with the fact that you're using the best people anywhere to be able to situate it in anywhere that you need any kind of staffing. Contributions are pretty much based on local and worldwide objectives. So let's keep moving on. So let's talk a little bit more about managing expatriates. How do we define expatriate? What is an expatriate? An expatriate is someone that has worked for the headquarters and is being sent overseas and is representing the headquarters. So those expatriates are people that are basically being given direction by the headquarters mainly. An example that I can give you is when I worked for Pfizer and I was sent to work for Colombia. I was being actually given direction from the headquarters in New Jersey or Morris Plains. Everything that I had to deal with was purely directed to the headquarters, but I was living in a foreign market. As living in a foreign market, I have different types of compensation, different types of managing, different types of performance that I have to kind of report back to headquarters. So what are some of the things that managing expatriates have to be considered? The job factor is important. What kind of job you're going to be getting when you go overseas? How do you relate that into what's being given to you? What motivates you when you're overseas? What are some of the family situations? Well, I have my husband, my kids are going with me. And then the same thing, in order to succeed from a selection of my expatriates, is the language skills. How much more do you know if you're being sent to a foreign market that speaks French, do you have the foreign skills? So in order to succeed, in order to be able to manage the expatriate, you have to have the job factors, has to be a motivation for the job, the family situation has to be very stable, and you should at least have some language skills. Here's a couple other areas that are very important. In order to select an expatriate, you need to consider different factors. The stress level, meaning can someone really deal with the stress of living in a foreign market? How tolerable? How can someone be very tolerable going to another market? Extroversion, as you go overseas, is this something that you can eventually deal with the change? That's going to determine the success for the particular expatriate. So that selection is very important. So let's talk more about performance. When it comes to expatriate performance management, it has to do with the fact that the headquarters is going to be selecting someone with specific criteria. It is very important that the headquarters, when they select this expatriate, that they're able to do some well preparation, training, orientation. If they don't have the correct training and orientation, there might be a challenge there to the point that they might not succeed. So it's very important to be able to select the right candidate, present them with the right training, and at the same time, you want to be sure that you do have some support from the headquarters. In many cases, you have someone that is being selected to work for a foreign market. They might end up being sent for 6 months to a year. But if the headquarters does not support them, if that does not keep in touch with them, there's going to be most likely not a success in their performance when they're overseas. The last one has to do with the inability to adapt to a local culture. So as you're selecting and you're doing it to performance, maybe someone is not really used to the culture, and that could eventually allow them to not be able to perform correctly. All right, a couple more things about when it comes to management. Problems with the spouse and children. Keep in mind and remember this. Most of expatriates do not succeed because of the spouse or children or the family not being adjusted to the change. And one of the main reasons, number one reasons for expatriates not succeeding in a market has to do with problems with the spouse not getting used to the culture, not used to the assignment that they do. The family is the main, number one reason. Insufficient compensation, financial support is another one. You might be sent overseas, it might be very stressful, it might be a different role, it might be a different type of culture, but if you're not being compensated correctly, or there's not a lot of financial support, that can eventually end up having someone to return back to their home country. There might also be some kind of poor programs for career support and repatriation. Now, this word is critical, and I wanted to be sure that everyone understands. When I talk about repatriation, it has to do with the fact what really happens when they come back to their home country. And we're going to talk about what that means and how can that be something that the headquarters have to take care of. Now, when it comes to training and development, there are certain things that are very important. So let me give you some examples when it comes to training. So an example I give here is China. China has to do with the fact that someone might be sent to China to work overseas for some time, and when they're in China, they're going to run into situations where eating duck tongue and pigeon head is something very natural from the Chinese. And that might be very strange for someone coming from the US, but that's a very common thing in China. Another example is Brazil, and that has to do with home phones don't work. The frustration that when you're trying to call home or you're trying to call someone, that phone is not going to work, it's going to get disconnected. I'll give an example. So we have China and Brazil. I'll give an example when I lived in Colombia as an expatriate. It was the lights would go off. I might be watching TV, I might be trying to work in my computer and suddenly the electricity would die. And that's just natural, that was normal, it happened. In most countries you wouldn't think that the electricity would die, but it's something that you have to get used to it. So in the case of Brazil, home phones don't work. In other markets, there are certain things that don't work as well as they work here in the US. Another example was India. And that has to do with, you're going to see a lot of poverty. I did a lot of work in India, and as you're driving, as you're walking around, as you're living in India, you're going to see a lot of poverty, and that can be very hard for us to see, something we don't see here too much in the US, but in India it's very common, and it's something you have to kind of be sure. And it's just not India, there's so many other countries where there's a lot of poverty. So you got to train them to see what they're going to experience when you get there. Indonesia, you have to do with the fact that when you look at the in this particular case, the main here is that rent is paid at least 2 to 3 years in advance, which is something that we don't really have here in the US. We just pay month by month. But in the case of Indonesia, it is expected to pay rent 2 to 3 years way in advance. So prepare yourself for that. And then another example is given in Japan. Doctors reveal little to patients. So if you get sick, don't expect doctors to tell you a lot about it. They just tell them you have, take this, and that's what it is. So sometimes we get used to hoping and expecting that what we see here in the US is going to be the same thing we see in other markets. So train expatriates to realize that that's not going to happen. It's going to be very different as you go to foreign markets. All right, a couple more things here. And Japanese expatriates. So I want you to emphasize, do remember, and try to take notes. Why is it that the Japanese tend to succeed a little bit more than the expatriates from the US? And expatriate training and development for Japanese tend to be much more of a long term. So they might have assignments between, 5 to 10 years, whether in the US it might just be 6 months to a year. In my case, when I was in Japan, I was there for about 6 to 4 months. When I lived in Colombia, I was there for about a year. So it's short term. And the Japanese is more of a long-term perspective, which tend to be the reason why they succeed. They can kind of get used to a long-term being overseas for that time frame. Selection based on long-term knowledge of executives and their families, so they select them if they're willing to stay that long. And then, of course, there's an extensive headquarters support. Headquarters always have to be available for support, where in some cases in the US, or in some other markets, when they send you overseas, they don't keep up with you, and so it's more like there's not a lot of support, and that can cause a lot of failure for expatriates. All right, this is a very important chart. So basically what it's telling you, what is the process of international human resources when it comes to maximize effectiveness of expatriate assignments? So let me walk you through this chart. So the way we start, and I think what I can do here is kind of walk you a little bit through how this works. In order to improve the process of international HR process in general, international area, you start first by looking at the, oops, I think I did the wrong thing, sorry about that, so let me go back again. So let's kind of look through, let me kind of see if I point out an arrow here, maybe that's probably what I'm trying to do. So the first thing we want to do is, you start at this level, and you're going to end up at this level. I'm not sure if I'm doing this right. Okay, so you start at this level. And what you're going to do is you're going to carry on the process all the way to the point you're going to end up at the end to improve that particular process. So let me kind of start by saying the first thing you do, and let me kind of underline where I am. The first thing you do, you're going to evaluate potential problems before you select that expatriate. You're going to select what might be an issue as you select someone going overseas. Once you talk about the potential problems, then you go ahead and select that particular individual that is going to be working in a particular country. Once you develop or select that expatriate, you're going to develop a contract that is going to be for a specific expatriate. So developing that contract can be very specific and be very unique. So you evaluate, select, develop. Once you develop the contract, now you're going to assess the development of that particular individual and the support needs that he has. Then you're going to go further and talk about efficientness of any problems, or talk about how did you evaluate becoming more effective. Lastly, you continue to understand how do we make that assignment more successful. You look into the integrated value for the firm as you have that expatriate being hired and selected. So you're going to look into the value for that particular expatriate. And lastly, don't forget that in some cases, families are not looked into an important part of an expatriate, which is the reason why I said earlier, the number one failure for an expatriate has to do with the fact that the families do not get adjusted. That's one of the reasons why expatriates don't succeed. So that process of evaluating, selecting, developing a contract, supporting them, looking into it, how do we evaluate effectiveness of problems, how do we go about looking into specific assignments, integrating that value to the firm, and let's not forget the family importance for the expatriate. All right, let's move on. What is culture shock? So we define culture shock, and here's where I want to emphasize a specific keyword. So culture shock has to do with the fact that there is going to be an anxiety about not knowing how to behave in a very unfamiliar culture. So that particular culture shock has to do with someone that goes to a foreign market and they just don't know how to behave, and there's a lot of anxiety. Culture shock has to do with not getting adjusted to a culture they're not familiar with. The goal of training is to ease that type of culture shock. So it is important to know that as we go to eliminating culture shock, training is critical. That's going to allow us to have someone that will maintain themselves in the market longer, because they will not go through culture shock as quickly or as often if we do some training. What about subculture shock? So if I have been in class with you guys, I would have asked you, give me an example of culture shock. Culture shock has to do more with, and this is the key word here, is the subculture shock. So sub has to do with the fact that it has to be more, and I can give you an example. When I moved from New York City to Kansas City, Missouri, that was what I call a subculture shock. I was in the same country, same part of the country. So the key word here is I'm transferring myself to another part of that country. So if I'm in the US and I go from New York City to Kansas City, I am going to be dealing with a subculture. Same country, but two different regions. That allows me to figure out New Yorkers are very different to Kansas City. New Yorkers tend to talk fast, tend to be very direct, tend to not waste time, and they get to the point where in Kansas City we tend to be much more slow, relaxed, maybe we don't talk as fast. So it's the same country, but just two different cultures. So that's what I call subculture shock. All right. Let's talk about a little bit of those steps that are important. I will ask you to identify what are the steps or what are the process of a culture shock. We're going to talk about these four ones. Honeymoon has to do when someone goes to a foreign country. They're excited about being, let's say, in Paris or in France, and they think it's wonderful, everything is new, everything is unique, so you're in that kind of honeymoon stage. Then the longer you live in that country, in France, or in this case Paris in the city, you're going to find sometimes where you find the culture being so different, it's going to be a little bit irritating. So the irritation and the hostility happens as the second phase. You like the country, it's exciting, but at the end, certain things that are not like home are going to irritate you and are going to be to the point that's going to make you very, very uncomfortable. Then time passes by and you realize the honeymoon stage is gone. You have gotten used to the irritation, realizing that things are different. So now you're going to slowly start into gradually adjusting to that culture. So the adjustment starts taking effect on the third stage. And lastly, it has to do with the fact that you're going to have a biculturalism, which means now you are adjusting to both cultures. You don't lose being who you are, but at the same time you're adjusting to the culture where you're at. So if I ask you what are the four different types of culture shock: honeymoon, irritation or hostility because you're upset about being something you don't understand, gradually getting adjusted to it and eventually becoming very used to both cultures, biculturalism. All right, let's talk about training techniques. So how do you go about training someone who's going to be going overseas? What's important? How do you go about making things easier? You definitely want to have an expatriate being someone that stays longer into a market. It costs about $1 million to send someone overseas. Maybe now more because things have changed with the economy, and companies don't want to lose $1 million. They train you, they give you all kinds of different techniques, they hope you stay in a market. So what can you do to train someone well so they succeed and they don't eventually leave in that particular assignment? There are different types of areas of studies. They can put them into a specific research area that they're going to be working on. They might, if someone is working in the technical side and they're going to Germany, they put them into a very specific technical area to learn from a German type of corporation. So in a specific area of studies. They can also give them a cultural simulation. How do they go about integrating themselves to foreign cultures? So they kind of play a role of culture before you go into the market. Language training. If you don't speak the language in your foreign market and you're living there, it's going to become very challenging. So not only learn the culture, but learn the language can make things much easier for an expatriate. Sensitivity training. That means you must be very sensitive to someone's culture. You might not be willing to accept a culture and change your culture, but at least be sensitive about the change. Sensitive about the fact that there's two different cultures and you have to accept that they have a different culture than yours. Be sensitive to that. So sensitivity culture, be more able to adapt. Then they can also do training techniques such as field experience, and that means putting you in the field and allow you to experience that, being right in the marketplace into a specific experience. And then lastly, host family surrogates, where you eventually, before you live there, they put you with a family from that country so that you can get used to understanding what it would be like to live there. All these are different techniques of training, so that by the time you do move into a foreign market, you have already gotten a sense and an idea of the things that you need to be, the language, the culture, how to live in a foreign market, be sensitive about it, areas and field expertise. All right. This chart basically tells you there were companies such as Pepsi, ABB, AT, where they eventually start looking into corporation programs. And so they adapted some programs to help expatriates get much more acquainted to a particular market. So in the case of ABB, they rotate about 500 managers to different countries every 2 to 3 years. When I worked for Pfizer, I was rotating in all kinds of different jobs, different departments in different countries myself, and that was just to see how much could I be adjusted to one country, to one market, to one division. So adjusting and rotating managers was it's a great program for everyone to kind of get adjusted to different types of responsibilities and different cultures. Pepsi had a different types of strategy. In his case, bringing foreign managers to the United States for 1-year assignments. So here they're rotating. So rotation was one strategy. Here they are actually bringing foreign nationals to work within the US. And in the case of British Telecom, they use some kind of mentoring between expatriates and potential assignees. So they're kind of mixing both and kind of working together and mentoring them. So those are different ways where they can eventually train them. All right. So one thing that is very important, companies are always looking to find people that are willing to be mobile, people that are willing to go overseas. Be mobile means to get somewhere and to grow within a company, you must go to places, meaning be flexible, be willing to go to a foreign market. So in the case of Citibank, they gave advice that if you want to grow within the company, you must be willing to take an assignment overseas. So in order to grow, in order to be able to become part of a cadre of professionals and becoming a global professional, their recommendation was allow yourself to go to a foreign market, go to places. A global move is a good career, and in some cases being an expatriate has both positive and negative. Some people want to go overseas, get the experience, and some people don't want the fact that they might go overseas and be forgotten. So in this case, a global move for most careers means that you will become very unique and will require new skill. So they encourage that people eventually go and become an expatriate and take an expatriate assignment. All right. Here's a couple other things that I want to mention. Integrating training with global orientation. So how do you do that? There are different stages. The most simple one is to go and do a export stage, which is the most basic one. Basically, it's very low training because you're exporting, you're working with companies in other markets, but you are not really totally submerged in that particular culture. You're just starting to export. So there's going to be some training involved, but it's going to be very low to moderate. At the same time, you're going to be looking to do some training when it comes to skills and values, business behavior, because you're going to be exporting, so you really want to understand the market as you're exporting. The other part has to do training to understand parent country products and policies. So again, here is the part that when it comes to that particular export stage, the most important is just understanding the training back in the parent country. The other stage that is a little bit more involved than export has to do with multi-domestic stage, and that has to do being a little bit much more into a training from moderate to high. Now you're getting much more involved in the stage. You are integrating yourself not only with the culture, with the skills, but you're also maybe looking into understanding the technology of the country, what are the business practices and the laws. You're trying to familiarize yourself with specific production services procedures, which in the past was more like or in the export stage has to do more with the parent country policies. And the one from multi-domestic stage, you're looking more to understand the service and procedures from that particular country. So it's a little bit more involved. Now we get into much more in depth, and that has to do with two more stages. One is multinational, and the other one is global. Multinational is pretty high to moderate, where at that point you're becoming much more, doing a training that is becoming much more global. Now you're looking into the skills, you're looking into the technology, you're looking into the culture, you're looking into the strategy, you're looking into the business practices. Don't forget that there's going to be looking now into specific areas that are purely much about the country. So you're looking into all kinds of different skills. You're going to get into areas that you didn't get with export in the last one that has to do more with the multi-stage. Now we're getting into specific areas about corporate culture, services, much more detailed but technical areas. And the last one is totally submerged into a global stage, pretty high in training. You're now going 100% global. Now you're looking at customers, culture, global competition, strategy. You are 100% purely global and might have very high training as you eventually go into this stage. You have to be pretty much proficient, be more effective in the systems, more effective in the culture, more effective in the business policies and so forth. So it's 100% pretty much opposite to the export stage. All right. So here's a little bit of factors that influence that integration of expatriates with local staff. So those factors have to do with how do we help them. Some factors helps expatriates become much more, they become much more adaptable, or they become much more integrated into a culture, versus another one can be more of a challenges. So when we look about helping expatriates, we're talking about helping them where they eventually have a close working relationship with locals, learning local language, understanding how to work with technology and business knowledge for that market, integrating into the local life, helping them understand more the culture sensitivity, willingness to learn, and then be able to adapt to a new market. Helping them to get through all these areas are important. But there are other areas and other factors that could be more influencing or more challenging for them. And that is to do with not using the team concept, not working with them, just keeping them very isolated, not learning the local language and just keeping themselves to only English, very arrogant. The way we do things in the US is the best way, so that kind of arrogance when you go to a foreign market. Spouse and family are not adjusting and not really helping the spouse or the family to adjust to the market. And then many more, lack of curiosity, not interested in being there, just wanting to be there to do a job and not learning about the market, acting like they want to really be back home and homesick. So these are all the challenges that are going to jeopardize an expatriate going overseas. All right, a few more things. Compensation is important. So I'm going to share my experience as I was in a foreign market. As I would work overseas, I was being paid in dollars. I was not paying in the currency that I was, in the case I lived in Colombia, and I was there for about 1 year, and I was being paid dollars At the same time, the dogs were being paid, everything was compensated. I got a free housing, free car, free benefits. Everything was given to me at that particular country, and then my salary was being deposited in dollars, and I was hardly even using my salary. So compensation can be fairly nice as you're an expatriate. Companies are looking for ways to cut costs, and so they might be eventually looking to find ways to compensate an expatriate based on a specific area, so they might cut some costs there. At the same time, the need to reconcile parent and host country practices is something that they're kind of looking to see how do they compensate the parent with the foreign market that you're working with. Tax is important, whether you pay taxes in that market or you don't pay taxes at all as you're living in a foreign market. Components of that compensation package can be salary, taxes, allowance, and benefits. So as an expatriate, they're going to talk to you about what is part of the package so that you eventually will go and live overseas. So here's a little bit of the summary. The package is important when it comes to expatriates. They're going to have a salary. The salary can be a local salary, buying power, versus home salary. So it might be the currency that I had mentioned, what kind of currency they're going to pay you. Taxes, whether it has to be, how much taxes do you pay depending on the country you're living in, or you don't pay any taxes. The company pays for you. Allowances, in my case, I got a car, I got benefits, I got, my housing was paid for, relocation was paid for, going there and coming back, and trips going home. So everything was pretty much paid as an expatriate. So you kind of save all that money and the company takes care of you. And then, of course, the regular benefits, health insurance, stock options, and so forth. So that's kind of part of the whole package for the expatriates. Here's a little bit of an example, and these numbers could have varied some. An example from a company that had a base salary plus the salary of that affiliate. When you compare with other countries, depending on where you live or depending on the city that you are, in the US we have about $100,000 that we're paying. In Tokyo it's about $150,000, it's more expensive to live there. Mexico is a little bit less because it's not as expensive to live there. Relocation, they're going to give it about another 20% if you go to Tokyo, or $15,000 if you go to Mexico. Housing allowance, as I mentioned, giving them a house or an apartment to live in. Private education for your children, if you have children or you have a spouse, so eventually they will pay for that education while they're living in that country. And then of course they will give you money to be able to come home in a particular time frame, 4 times a year or whatever years you negotiate in your contract. So when you're in the US, you're getting paid about $100,000. If you compare it to an expatriate that is going to Tokyo or going to Mexico City, even though Tokyo is a very expensive country versus Mexico, look at the difference between salary. You're doing the same job, but you're in a foreign market. From $100,000 to $252,000 in Tokyo to $135,000 in Mexico. You're still making quite a bit of money in a package compensation because of where you're going and what you're doing. All right, a few more things about this chapter, and that has to do about training human national corporations when they're working in integrating them, link successful corporations, cultures, and local culture. They're trying to kind of work into how do we train them where they can kind of understand how to behave in the culture that they're going to be sent. They also do some kind of e-business adoption. Everything's pretty much done online, and there's much more understanding about becoming more of an expatriate as you go to foreign markets. There was a couple of examples in your book, and they talk about challenges that some companies had, like Starbucks, when they were actually in China, in Beijing. Challenges about recruiting, finding people that were motivated, finding people that eventually they can retain. Chinese recruits want training and advanced opportunities more than money. So they were more interested in that type of training, that type of advancement. They were not so interested in how much money they get paid. Very different to what it would be in another market, like in the US. So they ran into some challenges. They were totally very different to what was expected in the US. Okay, let me move on. And here's a little bit of compensation again. When we compare different markets, the Europeans require more cash than Americans. When it comes to Japan, they require compensation is pretty much about similar or becoming more like westernized. Chinese workers resist from pay. They're more interested in performance. So a little bit more what compensation does. And then when you compare different types of compensation, best practices, for Latin America and for the United States and for other markets. It all depends on incentives that are being given to them. Also has to do with the fact of how do they work in groups, do they work individually? And specifically, you know, whether you're working in the US, in China, or in Taiwan, that's going to vary on the compensation. All right, and I think I want to, here is kind of a couple other examples. Getting along is an important part. We wanted to be sure that they get measured, the best practice to get along with every different person, whether you are in the US or you go overseas. So that's a big selection process, getting along with others. Specific skills that you might have, and then depending on your skills, you're being sent to Korea, Japan, Taiwan. So focusing on your particular experience, your skills, and getting along with people. Country specific might be more to do with, like Japan looks for a person with more potential, driven to employment tests. Taiwan relies on interviews, and so every country relies on different things. And I have two more slides. This one has to do more with the fact that could be better in all countries, emphasis on development and documentation. The expression is used little in Asian countries. In Latin America, has to do more with administrative purpose of importance. In Taiwan, the purpose is a little bit much more important. So again, how do we go about emphasizing that? I'm going to skip a couple of these ones that are just more examples in general, but has to do with the fact that you know, best practice with to do with performance and appraisal. That kind of lowers differentiation in cost and strategies. And so the main thing that I want you guys to remember about this chapter, the conclusion about this particular chapter when it comes to expatriates, performance, what this international human resources function is, has to do with the fact that it's a very critical component of the global strategy. There's different strategies about selecting someone, and those are the 4 different approaches: ethnocentric, polycentric, regiocentric, and global, and be able to determine examples for those 4 specific strategies. The #1 failure for expatriates is families not adapting. Their families not adapting to a particular market. That's the #1 reason why expatriates don't succeed. Cultural training, language familiarity with every training overall is definitely very much needed to be able to succeed in a foreign market. And compensation must be equally addressed, as compensation can really determine how an expatriate can succeed. That is what I have for this chapter. And now I'm going to provide you guys with a little bit of a continuation of chapter 10. Thanks.